museum in Vietnam. There are a lot of museums in Vietnam. The War Veterans Museum in Ho Chi Minh City or Saigon. And it's noted as one of the top museums in the world. It's her museum. And she's got some amazing stuff in there. And then finally, I said, sort of tongue-in-cheek, well, if they won't let me go and they want to hear one more poem, I'll read this one. And they didn't, but I'll still read it anyways. All right? It's from the perspective of a grandfather. It's entitled Grandfathers. In some of our homes, we have our children stand with their backs to a kitchen post. We then mark their heights with chalk on the post and date these marks. A fun way to keep records. But then the war creeps back into my consciousness. Grandfathers. I watch my granddaughters grow up, their heights measured by chalking the kitchen post. So I think I know something about feet and inches as I watch grainy footage from the war of a Vietnamese grandfather, 4 arms of sinewy flesh, swinging his hammer with the authority of long experience, being interviewed by some American journalists. Staring into the hole of the camera through these 5 decades, I feel the agony of grandfathers so far removed from now, fashioning together coffin after coffin, each 3 feet long. And there is that film. I didn't make that film up. There is a film of this guy doing this. So after I read this poem, I put this on the board. This is Phan Thi Kim Phuc. About 10 years ago at a conference in Toronto, she's a speaker. She goes around, she does a lot of work and stuff like that. And my friend took a picture of her holding it. That's her. This doesn't capture everybody in the presentation, so because of my lousy slide skills. But in the front there, you see David, and right next to David is the guy who is the VC guy, the guy in the blue shirt, standing right in front of my son. Anyways, they had a formal banquet, which was like all formal banquets, loud, and crazy, great food, but there it is. The only time I wore sport food. And there she is again. She was just an amazing, she took us out to lunch. She brought her crew up from Saigon, from Ho Chi Minh City, to put together this thing we'll show you in a moment, and spent a lot of time with us. Great person. So this is the Waging Peace installation we had at the conference. And this is the official ribbon cutting ceremony. And then, there we are. It's Ron Carver, myself, and Chuck Searcy. And I will introduce you more to Chuck in a moment. Standing in front of this is in Vietnam now. This is there's a big hall, about a 10-minute walk from where the conference was taking place. And this display is going to be there all the way through, I think, November. GIs for Peace. You get inside the exhibition hall. U.S. soldiers and veterans who opposed America's war in Vietnam. Explaining stuff. Chuck, okay, a little bit more about Chuck Searcy. Chuck is, he was with the military intelligence. It's sort of a weird word to use, weird phrase to use, but in Saigon during the Vietnam War. In the early years, 65, 66. Came back, he's from Georgia, came back, went to school, started finding things wrong and all kinds of stuff, and ended up going back to Vietnam to begin this organization called Renew. And I've got the specific what that means. I'll find it in a minute. But basically what his job was is to work with the Vietnamese people and train them how to find unexploded ordnance in their villages. Because what was happening right after the war, and to this day, 50 some odd years later, you still have little kids walking along, picking up some little piece of metal, boom, okay? These are the cluster bombs that we want to put in Ukraine, by the way. Don't get me going on that. So, and he said, we've got to figure out a way to educate people about what these things are. Because he said at the end of the war, at 75 or 76, there were a lot of people who were figuring out they're going to make money with scrap metal. So they're looking around for scrap metal. And of course, unfortunately, some of these were these bombs that went off when they touched them. So, Chuck, and I'll jump ahead of myself a little bit. He took us around for 5 days. I was just honored to be with him the whole time. And virtually every place we went to, Vietnamese went, Mr. Chuck, Mr. Chuck, hello, Mr. Chuck, how are you? They revere this guy. So that's one of the posters. This is the guy. Ron Carver was actively involved in the GI resistance movement, the coffee houses, the GI coffee houses, and the underground newspapers in the military. This one's for those who would today ask why, but cannot. It's the rest of it. And so these are some of the, this is all Ron's work. LBJ was the famous jail in the Long Binh jail in Vietnam. You did not want to go there. Because usually they threw guys in there who were disobeying orders or whatever, got caught with dope or whatever, and they just kicked the crap out of you. You didn't want to go to the LBJ. More work resistance. They handed out these newspapers. If you were in the military back then, and if you were stateside, these guys are sneaking these newspapers into, you know, and they're all illegal according to the military, right? And they were facing tremendous repression. If they got caught doing this kind of stuff, you know, they were not only court-martialed, they were probably going to be sent to Leavenworth or something for distributing these papers, all right? But they set up these coffee shops just outside most of the bases to educate soldiers, get them to resist to the war. And, you know, and we claim, those of us in the Veterans Resistance Movement, that war was ended sooner because of the military falling apart. The officers started realizing that these guys are not going to follow orders. I did minor stuff like, you know, this little base camp, and these guys would show up, these majors would show up, and blah, blah, and they'd say, okay, we want you guys to take that deuce and a half and go over to Phuket Air Force Base, you know, and we go, sir, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. By the time we get up there and come back, it's night. We're not going. We're not going to drive those roads at night. And we look at them and say, yeah. And it happened a lot. It's happened a lot. Back in Way, my son now, when I'm at this conference, my son, bless his soul, is off on these picture-taking, wonderful trips. These places are all over the place. The art is just staggering. So I've got a piece in your packet there on the Citadel. And Josh went around and took a lot of pictures of the Citadel. And that was, as it mentions, the Imperial Court in Vietnam. And this is, at the heart and soul of the Vietnamese people, the Citadel. And here are some pictures of them. This is the street. Anyways, much. Those remind me of incense burners. I got incense burners that look like that. Lots of pictures from the city. Amazing park sculpture. Every park had these things. And they had public, bicycles and weightlifting and all that kind of stuff. If anybody did this, if you want to work out or something like that, here's a park. And then they had these sculptures. It's beautiful. And they have electric buses. Hello. And they have electric cars. So if we start referring to Vietnam as a third world country, better rethink that. They're on the move, big time. Okay, so now this is the Project Renew thing. So that's on the next, if you flip in your packet, that's the colorful Renew. Yes, here's what it stands for: restoring the environment and neutralizing the effects of the war. So after our presentation at the conference, we got on a plane and we flew to Dong Ha in Quang Tri province, where Project Renew has its offices. All right, and this is why I said I'm not going there as a tourist. Project Renew has been a very integral part of the Veterans for Peace group for a long time. So here we go. All right, supporters of Project Renew: the Irish, Norwegian groups, individual groups. The United States State Department and actually Defense Department provided a little support, backed off, and now, according to Chuck, they're providing more support as they're working. And what they do is, Project Renew, you see that map, okay, there's the staff, there's Chuck and myself and the staff. They get calls. They have 125 people on their staff, okay, and they're paid. And Chuck said they're paid well, okay. But their job is, if they get a call or something like that, there's something suspicious in village so-and-so, boom, they go down there and they look for it, okay? This is from their education center. Here's a staggering statistic, and I think it's valid. The United States used 3 times the amount of munitions used in World War II during the war in Vietnam. 3 times all of munitions used in World War II by all sides. 3 times that amount in Vietnam. In Quang Tri province, which is one of the more heavily hit, it's right up at the DMZ. And you want to know where? There they are. See those red, there's red dots for everywhere those bombs were dropped. And so the Project Renew is they're involved in what they call survivor assistance and risk education. So they go and they educate people, what's going on here, and then they provide support for people who lose their legs and their arms, whatever, prosthetics. They also, through Friendship Village, they provide support for people who are exposed to Agent Orange. We'll get to that in a moment. So this is what they do, survivor assistance and risk education. As you walk into their education center, this is their central display. It's sort of mind-blowing, staggering. So then I sat down with the staff and we talked strategies. I'm going to help them, see if I can help them raise some funds and stuff like that. And they were, these guys sitting there, the Vietnamese guys sitting there, they laughed about it all the time. They said, his dad was in the ARVN, the South Vietnamese Army. My dad was a Viet Cong. Ha ha ha, here we are together, right? Working together on stuff. They're dedicated to this stuff. That's the field board. That's the field assignment board, 125 of them out there on assignment. There's some of them, the Renew Field Crew. And here they are, getting ready to go out to the field, loading up. This is a diorama in the Renew Ed Center. This is how they looking for unexploded ordnance, UXOs they call them. These are the hoochies. This is what I remembered from Vietnam. Those are where the people lived. And they found them all over the place. All over the place. And this is the consequences of those cluster munitions. It's just an amazing display. And one of the things that really got me, they took us around for this stuff and they took us into this room. And here's a guy, you walk into this room, and there's one guy in there, this Vietnamese guy in there, and he's got a bandsaw, circular saw, a drill. He's making these things by himself, one at a time, slowly but surely. And he showed us pictures of guys, and I thought to myself, my God, there's so much, the technology that's out there now is so much more sophisticated for this stuff. We could get that to these people and help them immensely. Because Chuck said, most of the stuff now looking for the munitions in certain areas, they've pretty well taken care of that. But now what they're focusing on is helping these people who were hurt by these munitions. And that's the work that they're beginning to increase that work. And there's the guy at center accepting my books for the display. I brought a collection of 20 poems translated into French because I was told, the Vietnamese read stuff in French. Well, not too many. But anyways, they've got my books there now. It's my son Joshua, the director of Renew. The leader of Vietnam after Ho Chi Minh starts, that makes reference to the statue, not to the guy standing in front of it. I was told by Chuck that when Ho Chi Minh died, he died in '69, I believe, when I was over there. Actually, this guy who took over was a much tougher kind of guy, and he had to get stuff accomplished. But the people appreciated him for the most part. There's our driver. When we left the conference and went to Dong Ham and stuff, and we started out on the road. We were 5 days on the road, going to different places. And this guy was just a wonderful guy, wonderful. And Chuck speaks Vietnamese, he's sitting next to him, so we could translate back and forth. So along the way, they have all these monuments. So notice that monument, see anything strange about that? It's a monument to a tank, it's a tank. Wait a minute, look at the tread. There's a guy sleeping there. Okay? We got out of the car, we walked in, we said, hey, look at this, it's really cool. And all of a sudden we look and there's this guy sleeping. Okay, good night. Here's the famous DMZ, the demilitarized zone. The driver stopped the car, he said, get out of the car. So we get out of the car, he said, walk down that bridge. Once you cross that line, you're in North Vietnam. Now they don't consider North Vietnam, South Vietnam now as political divisions, but back in the day, right? If I crossed that bridge, if I crossed that line to go into North Vietnam, I'd do it as a POW, right? There's no way in hell we would ever do that. There we were, ready to cross that line. So here's a tunnel system. This is how the people survived. This is near Khe Sanh, we'll talk about that in a minute. There's the path to the system, getting closer, you're in it, okay? People lived in these tunnels, okay? They survived in these tunnels, all right? And if you see the light at the end of the tunnel there, literally, the light at the end, way at the end of the tunnel, that's it, South China Sea. So we came out of that tunnel and go, wow, there it is. You know, and this, our Vietnamese guide pointed out, he said, you know, American ships sitting right out there. You know, boom, you guys going after us. We're in here. We're in this tunnel. You know, and they had just these teeny little enclaves where these people lived for days, weeks, months. I mean, and Hemingway shows up, of course. Yeah. Water buffalo. Driving through well, that's okay. I guess we're going to stop here because they know who owns this place. So this is on the road to Da Nang, and this is when I landed in Hanoi and then went to Kuwait, these were cities. I was never in the city the whole time I was in Vietnam when I was there. This is what I remember. This is my Vietnam. This is the topography.
Is that kudzu?
Yes?
Is that what is now invading the American South?
Pardon?
I was asking if that's kudzu, the vine that's
Oh,
now invading the American South.
Oh, okay. Irony of invasions, right? Okay, I call this the ambassador. I have to love to tell the story. So we're on this road, right? And it's pretty much like a state highway. It's a pretty nice road. All of a sudden we stop at a long line of cars. What the hell's going on? So we get out and we look around, and these boulders had fallen down off this mountaintop. And so they had to bring in this bulldozer to move these boulders out of the way. So we're in this long line of cars. And all of a sudden this very official guy comes up to our driver and says, follow me, follow me. So we get back in the car, he gets in his car. This guy drives us all the way to the front of the line, in front of all these people. And we said, it's because Chuck. Doesn't he look like an ambassador? He's got his sport coat on. And they knew him, right? People knew, oh, Mr. Chuck, here, quick, front of the line. So we benefited from that, father and son. Chuck and my son Josh. Chuck just went through double pneumonia, so he's pretty gaunt, and he's still there. This comes from a famous book that I forget the title of, written by an ecologist. Nature Bats Last. I like that. Here, all this crap that we did to this country and stuff like that, 50 some odd years later, look at that. Still on the road. Entering this town, and I love this sign. You see the sign, the communist flag there, and the doves on the other side of it. More park sculpture, all over the place. So now we're entering Khe Sanh, and I gave you another handout in Khe Sanh, because again, a lot of people perhaps are not familiar with it. It's famous for, that's the Marine base that for 77 days was under siege during the Tet Offensive. The piece I gave you in your packet is an interesting piece because as the title says, the guy says, is this the greatest victory for the American military or the greatest defeat? When you go to the Khe Sanh Museum and you go to the Khe Sanh Plate Memorial and stuff like that, which I'll show you, it's from their perspective. It's like, guess what? We kicked your ass, okay? Most Americans say, oh, wait a minute, no, the Marines bravely fought and all that kind of stuff, and they were able to survive the siege and all that kind of stuff. And the Vietnamese said, yeah, this is what we did to you guys. Okay, so this memorial is memorializing the Vietnamese who were killed in those battles, but it's also capturing the point. And I was told, again, by Chuck, I believe, if you look at all of these graves, what they do is they bury a person, and after a year, they dig the person back up again, and they recollect their bones and put them down concisely. So every one of these little monuments have a person in it. These are the Vietnamese who died in that battle. My son Josh in the cemetery. Altars all over the place. There's Bodhi trees and altars just all over the place. So okay, so then you take a little bit further walk past this memorial stuff, and you start looking at, all right, what did we quote unquote leave behind? In 16. This is in their museum. They're saying, hey, see these guys? See, the American soldiers, you had this stuff? And this is the bunker. And I took pictures of this because this is how I lived. I lived in these bunkers. This is the way we survived. We're in these bunkers. Mine was bigger than that, a little bit bigger than that, but pretty much the same thing. Another one of the memorials to the fallen. Leaving Khe Sanh. There's a huge crowd there. I don't think it was a special day, but the people were laying flowers and their prayers, and they do a lot of incense stuff. This is in the center, capturing the perspective of that siege, if you will, from their perspective. They have dioramas in these museums all over the place, and here's one, on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Right? And they told us, guys we talked to, said, I'm literally talking to a guy who was in the NVA, and the Viet Cong and stuff like that. He said, you guys used to bomb our bridges, right? I said, yeah. He said, you know what we did? We built the bridges 6 inches under the water level. Okay, so you couldn't see it from the air. All right? The bridges were still there. Oh, these people took these weapons down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, down through these jungle trails and all that kind of stuff. This is the way they did it. This is the way they did it. We had all this military, we had this huge military. This is the force to use. They're also very big on, as I mentioned earlier, on ethnic groups, and I think these are Montagnards, where they lived. And I just took a picture of this because I'd never heard that phrase, the 1972 bombings. We called it the Blaze of Summer. Blaze of Summer. Ring that bell at the Khe Sanh Cemetery. Leaving the Khe Sanh Cemetery, memorial there, Bodhi tree. What a great way to end this experience at Khe Sanh. I bought coffee and peppercorns from this woman. She was wonderful. It's that kind of, again, that look on her face is she's not acting. It's just the kind of response we got. So then we went to the Friendship Village, and I have a little excerpt about that in your packet as well. And that was started by George Mizo, who's a member of Veterans for Peace, Vietnam veteran, who came back to Vietnam and wanted to work with victims of Agent Orange. And not just people directly hit by the Agent Orange, but then their children and then their grandchildren. And so he started this thing called the Friendship Village, which is just outside of Hanoi. And Chuck seriously was very involved in that. So there's soccer practice at the Friendship Village. It's a campus now. It started with one building. Now it's got a number of dormitories, classrooms, nurse stations and doctor stations. And they do this artwork. And here's one of the residents working on something. And this young woman was very attracted to my son. She wouldn't let him. Sign this, write this, write this, write this, write this. So then we go, now we're leaving Vietnam and we're in Hanoi. And this is another one of my Mr. Chuck stories I love telling. So we're in Hanoi walking around, and you go to the Hotel Metropole Hotel, right? This is where Obama stayed. This is where Clinton stayed. This is probably where Biden stayed, right? All the ambassadors and stuff like that. Big 10-star hotel, right? And they're doing renovations on it, and there's big steps, and people are guarding it and stuff. So we're standing outside looking at it. And all of a sudden somebody opens up the door and looks out and goes, Mr. Chuck, come. And so they take us inside this Metropole Hotel. And this is this shelter, bomb shelter. This is right in their very, very fancy restaurant, right there, okay? They discovered it in 2011, whatnot. But this is where Joan Baez stayed and Jane Fonda stayed during the bombings and stuff like that. Right in this fancy hotel. You got this bomb shelter. There's Jane Fonda. These are pictures taken from the Metropole. By the way, you go down the hallway, they've got all these pictures of these people. Joan Baez. I highly recommend the Joan Baez documentary, the American series. You can get it on PBS and Netflix and stuff like that, about her amazing life as an activist. And she did this incredible stuff. But in this thing, they actually have her there in Vietnam, in Hanoi, in 1972, when the bombing was taking place. And she's in the shelter. She went there with 3 or 4 other guys to deliver letters to prisoners, American prisoners and stuff. She was there when the bombing took place. And this film captures that, And she walks out of this shelter going, oh my God, you see all this incredible damage and stuff. She's one of my heroes. That's on the door to the shelter. Remember, forgive, forever. Yeah, another, you stop anywhere, and all of a sudden you see these little things. Lest we forget, you know, if you want to get struck by something, that flag is all over the place. My final picture from this trip, Beauty Abounds. But now, if you're ready for this, ready? Blurry, here we go. Boom, bridge into Bongsan, a little blurry. Tooling into the village. This is us, this is me, this is us. Coming through the village. Our tanks, and our guns. From the back of a deuce and a half. Weapons pointed all the time, all the time. And this image of the grandfather, this guy, I took this picture. You know, I can imagine some young punk in a uniform. This guy's just standing there looking at us, going, screw you. You know? Boy on a water buffalo. That's what we saw a lot of. We figured out how to get into the village. We were in this fire base, and everything was off limits. Everything was off limits. And we were in the country about 8 or 9 months, and 4 of us decided, screw it. So what we did was we would take our weapons and our flak jackets and our helmets, and we'd stack them outside the village. We just leave them there. One person watched those, and the rest of us would go into the village unarmed. Just to say, you know, we're human beings too. They thought we were crazy, but we went into the village. That's me, someplace there. That's how they did it. That's how they got their water supply. Typical house. This is along sort of a road into Bongsan. Street scene, altars all over the place. From a guard bunker. This is it. This is how we lived. Right? These are our guard bunkers. That's me again. What am I doing here? He asks. Warm beer every once in a while. They give us beer, but not much. That's where we stayed, and we built this thing. We took over this landing zone and turned it into a fire base. We kind of built that thing up. That's how we survived in that. Visitors from the village. If you notice in the background, I don't think you can see them too well. There's some choppers back there, some Apaches and stuff like that. We hated it when the choppers show up, because when the choppers show up, these guys usually came in and they put the choppers down and came in to our little fire base for the night and stuff like that. Of course the mortars are going to start coming in, right? They want to get these choppers. We like these guys a lot, though. They were good guys. Dumb kids. Oftentimes the middle finger. Right? But a lot of these kids, I mean, we wasted so much stuff, right? We dumped this stuff, and these kids would come through and just pour through it and pick all kinds of stuff out of our dump. There's that village dope dealer I referred to. Little butterfly, we called her. What is she, 10 years old? 12 maybe at most? There's the enemy.
Yeah.
Concertina wires, there they are. These little kids would come up to the wire and just look at us, you know, stare at us. That's a picture from the village. So I'd like to end this all with a reading of this poem I wrote for my son, if I can find it. It's in your packet. I wrote this poem when we came back. It's called Vietnam Redux. It's the last thing on the one side of the booklet there. Going back for Josh. I look twice now where I used to look only once, like when routes 2 and 4 merge with Route 156, or when my imagination takes me to a little village just on the other side of the river Styx, where there truly was hell to pay those many years ago, across that river and up and down those swirling tides, where Beelzebub got to play with his gift box of G.I. Joes, as we desperately hung on for his satanic well ride. I went back to that land of my 50-year-old dreams, thinking I'd finally put some nightmares out to pasture, hoping to quiet down those mama-san beetle-mouth screams, looking for that proverbial sense of closure. But who am I to expect more from this madly tortured land that once swallowed up my illusions of masculine grandeur and spat out a soldier boy who had tried to become a man, only to become a tool of that mindless, endless slaughter. Thank you. So, Questions, comments, thoughts? Yes?
I just want to remember my dear military veteran friend who died 2 days ago in a serious car accident. And we have so many people like you who have been in the military. I have never been in the military, but please remember all of our friends and be there for everyone. And so many of the young people now, I'm your age, we need to help them to think about these things. And I wonder, what did your son think about this trip when because he, you know, what was his reaction to all of this?
Many reactions. Let me see if I can encapsulate it somewhat. First of all, I sort of, Judy's here, a woman to whom I've been married for 52 years.
Oh, sweet.
Josh's mom, but I told myself I was not gonna lay this war on these kids. I was not gonna be one of these fathers that told war stories to my kids and all that kind of crap. So he comes to Vietnam with me now, and all of a sudden, we're doing this stuff. We're a military. And those of us in the military, we just do this automatically. As soon as we get together, boom, you know, it's all of those, you know, phrases and words and stuff like that. And Josh is just sitting there watching the stuff going on. And he loves it, you know. And he's an international traveler. He goes all over the place. He's never been to Southeast Asia, so he liked the idea of going to Southeast Asia. So he liked encountering me there. And he said one thing to me I loved. He said, you know, he'd been to Mexico a lot. And he said, you know, when you walk down some streets in Mexico, and that's because these people, you walk down these streets in Vietnam, there are all these vendors, they're all over the place. Not one of them approaches you and says, hey, come here. They just, you know, you walk by, if you stop, they talk to you, if you don't, that's cool too, right? And he just said, I felt so relaxed. He wandered around by himself in Hue and Hanoi, and he said, I just felt so relaxed being there in this country. And then, you know, and he was very moved by the Friendship Village and Project Renew. So, you know, he got a real education, if you will, about the impact of the war. He's a good guy.
Hopefully he will share also with other people.
Oh, he will.
Good.
Yeah, he will. I know he will. Yeah. Yes?
What was the strategic importance of Quezon, Doug?
According to whom? According to the United States military, we said, okay, this is the point where we're engaging with the NBA troops and stuff coming in from Laos, and you know, and so we're going to stop it right here. We're going to stop it right here, okay? And it was also, according to the United States military, a show of strength. I'm going to do it right here.
I have a good friend I used to work with, Don Zetchi, who's been dead for I don't know how many years, but he was at Quezon.
Yeah.
He used to tell me stories about it. He said there was a lot of blood and a lot of mud.
Yeah. Well, a guy who lived around the street from me, he was a year behind me in high school, and one of my brothers was engaged to his sister. He was killed at Quezon, and he was killed. He was a young Marine lieutenant, I believe, who led the first group foray out of the thing, and they were killed, all of them.
Yeah, when they had to supply them, he said that there was so much fire that the 123s that were resupplying would just kind of do a touch and push the stuff out onto these runways that were made out of what do you call it, with the metal?
Yeah, I know.
And just go because they couldn't stop it. It was crazy.
So, but if you read that piece I gave you, the guy did some research on the Vietnamese perspective of that, and they said, aha, okay, this is where we're going to show these guys that we really can take them on toe to toe, okay, and defeat them, okay. So for the Vietnamese, this was a huge victory, right? When they left after 77 days, 69, 70, they left. These guys came in, and as you can see from the museum, they said, we did it. You know, Ho Chi Minh said, this is what we can do. All right, so it was an inspiration for them. Of course, if you read the United States military accounts, the bravery of the Marines, you know, standing up against all these odds and all that kind of stuff. Yes, of course. You know, and really what we did was we diverted the NDA, according to this one account. We diverted them from attacking other places, so it really was a victory on our part. You know. It's like if you're in the military, right? When you're in your military, it depends on whose perspective you're getting. Who won? Yes, sir. Yeah.
My name is Titit Bakara. I want to congratulate you and many others who are working and putting time, energy, effort to build peace. I'm so amazed to see how people or nation could come come together after war, after conflict, after fight,
Yeah.
but as a human being say we should come together as one human family. That's so amazing. But in the other side, we still experience a lot of injustice. Vietnam, yes, is for me, okay, from my perspective, is like far away. I was not born yet when it happened. I'm from Africa. Now I'm living in the United States. I'm so interested about how people could live together no matter where they come from, the color of their skin, religions, and sexual orientation. That's why I'm so glad to be present today. So my question is, do you have any advice or thoughts how we could consolidate or reinforce love, brotherhood, humanity in the state of Maine, and as you already start to do an amazing work in Vietnam and just try to experience the same thing here where we live in Maine?
You want my advice, do you? Uh-oh. Yeah. Okay, Veterans for Peace. By the way, Veterans for Peace, we formed in 1985, 5 of us here in the state of Maine. Now, it's an international organization now with 5,000 members or so, whatever, United Nations NGO status. We have 6 international chapters and all that kind of stuff. But our role is to talk to people, young people in particular, about the realities of war and stuff like that. And we're not anti-military, right? We're not saying, okay, we shouldn't have a military. I mean, that's kind of naive, right? But what should the military be used for? And so I think the hope and the love comes from the idea of talking to everybody as a human being. You know, we're all victims of war. There's no such thing as a victory in a war, right? As far as I'm concerned, there's no good war ever, never. Okay, and the Vietnamese people really showed us that. I mean, they were genuinely welcoming to us. And I thought, you know, hell, if I lived I live in this little town of Chesterfield. If there's some guys that came there and beat the crap out of my family and raped my daughter and shot my uncle and all that kind of stuff, would I welcome them back? And they did, because they have exactly what you're saying. You're saying we're all family, we're all together in this, okay? And yeah, there are some horrible things being done by all sides, but we've got to, you know, respect each other and stop these wars. Right? And you know, the Ukraine war is a perfect example for us. I'm not going there. No. Okay, but it's that whole notion of we've got to figure out a better way. All right. And so you're coming to this country and being here and welcomed, I hope, is part of that whole thing. And me going to that country and being welcomed is part of the whole thing. I have this old cliche I love to say. I said one of the worst things human beings ever invented was the nation state. Right? What's the difference between a French person and a Belgian person, a Spanish person, a Canadian person, a Mexican person, you know, a Saudi Arabian person? What's the difference, right? You know, these stupid ideas that we've got to fight a war because we're protecting this over from this. No. So I don't know. I'm not the only one who's aged here and got some good advice, some wisdom. So if you want to answer his question, anybody else want to jump in on that? Yes, Kathy?
I was just gonna, I don't know whether you can verbalize this, but it sounded like from your last poem that your expectation of maybe not feeling some of the things you felt, you still have all those feelings.
Mm.
But what kind of healing did this trip give you?
It gave a lot, you know, and again, like I said, I don't think all poetry is autobiographical, right? I'm trying to write it from a veteran's perspective. But I have this thing about, I have no right to ask the Vietnamese people to forgive me. I can't do that, okay? If they do forgive me, I will gladly accept that. And that's what the girl in the picture poem is kind of about that too, you know, we stand in this village together and stuff like that. So it was a real sense that there's space for forgiveness and for hope and stuff like that, but it's through action. It's not through just words. It's not through me going, oh, I'm really sorry, all that kind of stuff. No, it's okay, how can I help provide Project Renew with these prosthetics? How can I help the Friendship Village deal with, and their numbers now are increasing, okay, because the impact of Agent Orange on villages deep into that country is still coming out, right? I mean, some of those kids, you know, there are pictures of kids, you know, who are great grandchildren who are horribly, physically, mentally, just by that war. And Project Green says, what we want to do is go into the villages, we want to provide these people who live in very rural, very poor areas, accessibility. We want to give them nurses, we want to give them doctors, we want to rebuild their houses so that these kids could live in their house with them, you know. That's the kind of stuff that we're trying to do, you know. Yes, yes, sir.
Have you read The Best and the Brightest, David Halberstam?
No. I should, eh?
It was investigative journalism
Yeah,
into the Vietnam.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think this guy, Ron Carver, I made reference to, actually travels with Halberstam. And he actually, the last time he went back to Vietnam, he brought this guy, Ron Rittenhauer, and all these people who were involved in the war, took pictures and journalists and stuff like that to capture the kind of sense. But, okay, I'll read. I'm reading a book now called The Dust Child. I'm reading, there's 3 or 4 books I'm reading now. The Dust Child, in Vietnam, they were called Children of the Dust, and they were children who were born from American fathers, Vietnamese mothers, okay? So they're treated horribly in Vietnam, okay? Because they look different, right? And this book I'm reading now is a beautiful book called The Dust Child, about her family. It's written by this Vietnamese woman, about how they're dealing with all of that kind of stuff. So there's that stuff going on too, and you know, we just have to dig a little deeper, right, to find all this kind of stuff and forget all these other distractions and work on that. But I'll pick up on that book.
One thing I want to add is that I missed draft by 5 years. So I'm lucky, grateful, I don't know how you want to put it. But I belong to a veterans group that we come in and share stories and support each other. And the group is about 12 guys, and 5 of them are Vietnam veterans. And one guest came in and told a story about how the Vietnam veterans, I mean, they were coming home in cities because if they came in uniforms.
Oh,
And told a story about meeting a person from Vietnam War era that worked at USO. And one thing they never said to Vietnam veterans was, welcome home.
yeah, we say that now all the time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and just want to say welcome home.
Thank
And if you ever run into Vietnam veterans, please say welcome home, because
Yeah,
all those 5 guys in my group, they broke down in tears.
yeah. Two responses. Okay, the person sitting behind you. When I processed out of Vietnam, I went through Fort Lewis, Washington, right? This is August of 1970. I flew in my uniform to San Francisco Airport because they got a half rate on this thing. I took my uniform and threw it away, right? Judy, whom we had dated in college, met me in San Francisco, and we took a bus down to Los Angeles and decided to hitchhike across the United States. So we were on the road for what, 3 weeks? Give or take?
Probably.
Yeah. So here I am, right, you know, uniform, civvies and all that kind of stuff. Honest to God, I get in a car and it took about 15 nanoseconds. You a non-vet? Jesus, how the hell do you know? First I had short hair, right, so like that. But there was something about that. But and again, Judy's here, she can correct me. Everybody was very friendly and welcoming. We moved to Boston in the early 70s, which was, Chuck and Cambridge, all these radical groups and stuff like that. They welcomed us with open arms, right? Vietnam veterans, right? Because we were working against the war, that part of thing, stuff like that. But there was that whole process, and I wrote a poem about being invisible, and we really wanted to be invisible. We did not want parades. Most of the guys I know, I didn't want a goddamn parade. When I finally got home to Rochester, New York, I lived in the suburbs, and my parents had a big sign in front of the house, "Welcome home, Doug." Oh God, I don't want that. I don't want that, right? And so for a long time, we got what we didn't want, but so. I have mixed feelings about that. I mean, you say the welcome home thing, and I think the welcome home thing is a much better thing than saying thank you for your service. Because you just don't know what somebody did. You're thanking me for what I did. Just say welcome home. So that's the best thing to say. And the other thing is, for 3 years I volunteered at Togus, a psychiatric hospital. Once a week I would go and meet with patients and I'd use poetry. Patients would be there and I'd get them encouraged. We'd read some poetry starting from Walt Whitman all the way through the Afghan and Iraq war veterans. We had a mixture of Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghan veterans in there. But the whole process of beginning to put together words and poems and creating this thing, this artifact. And so what we would do is we would talk about that thing on the table, not you. They took a lot of the stuff from the therapy. We're not talking about you. We're talking about that thing, this poem. Okay, it's an end rhyme here, this kind of stuff like that. And they found that incredibly. The nurses said that was very therapeutic for them because they could talk about it without talking about it. Sort of a distance kind of thing. So, I don't know. I digress. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Doug, what was it that helped you, led you to change from knowing that you didn't want to be there and thinking it was probably a bad idea, to believing that it was way beyond a bad idea and that all war was a bad idea? Was there something in particular that led you to that transformation?
Huh. Wow. I don't know. I get into difficult conversations with people about World War II, for example, the so-called good war. One of the things I did when I came back to the United States, I worked for a year in the hospital in Boston. Then I went back to school and got my Master's of Arts in teaching English, because I wanted to go into the high school scene and deal with young people and stuff. But in the process of doing that, I felt it was necessary for me as an educator to educate myself as much as possible about Korea, Vietnam, about World War II, World War I, and all that kind of stuff, and bring some of that stuff into the classroom discussion. Because a lot of young people, they don't talk about this stuff at all. And I ended up ending my career at the University of Maine in Farmington, where I taught peace studies course. And I wouldn't tell the students, well, halfway through the course I'd finally be revealed to them that I'm a Vietnam veteran. But I wouldn't tell them ahead of time. And we use this wonderful book called The History of Nonviolence in America, from Stoughton and Alice Lynn from the 17th century right up through the Iraq wars, right? And it's telling the perspective of American history from the peace movement, not from wars, right? So I bring in discussions about these things, and inevitably, my grandfather was in World War II. Now it's my grandfather was in Vietnam. So, I guess I'm getting old. But we'd have these discussions, and I would say, what constitutes a victory? When does somebody win a war? And you talk to the Vietnamese people, they won that war. Whether we might not want to admit that, but they won that war. But what a tremendous cost. Oh, and by the way, I'll tell a story. Chuck Searcy, the guy there, skinny guy and stuff like that. If you turn to the New York Times last week, I believe, when Joe Biden was in Hanoi, there's Chuck standing right next to him. Because they asked him, as the director of Project Renew, to come, and he said, I met him, he's a nice guy, we didn't talk politics. He said, I disagree with a lot of his politics, we didn't talk politics. Nice guy and all that kind of stuff. But Chuck is he's a perfect example of a guy who's devoted his life to looking at wars and stuff, and talking and being in intelligence during the war, so he knew some Vietnamese people, and afterwards, stuff like that. He said, you lost 3 million people. You lost all of this land here. Did you win the war? And he said he would get different responses from different people, depending upon where they're coming from. And I think that's where I'm coming from. That whole notion is sort of, it's not ambiguity as much as it's like I just can't put my finger on a military victory, quite frankly, right? And I know people object to that. Some people have objected to that. I'm not going to get into Ukraine. What else? It's been here a while. Yes, sir. Yeah.
One more question. I researched throughout to find out if Jane Fonda ever became remorseful or if she apologized. Does anybody here know
Yes.
whether she has?
Yes. She's a member of Veterans for Peace. She's on our advisory board, by the way. Thank you very much. She deeply regrets that there's a very famous picture of her with an anti-aircraft gun in North Vietnam. She put a helmet on, was there, I got a big smile, and took a picture of her, right? I mean, when I used to go to Togas, I see a guy here on the side of his car. This is, 8 years ago, something like that. F. Jane Fonda, right there. They hate her. They hate her.
Hanoi Jane.
Yeah, Jane. Yeah. And she said that. She was anti. The people don't realize that she went around with Donald Sutherland, and part of the what's the tour, FTA tour, yeah, Blank the Army tour, right? And she went on bases and she went talk, they, you know, had fun, and entertained the soldiers, if you will, because she really cared about them. And if you listen to her speak, she really cared about us and stuff like that. She deeply regrets some of that stuff. She said, I made a bad move.
Good.
You talk to a lot of people from our era, and they said, I made a bad move, I regret that. And she regrets that. But she supported Veterans for Peace, she works with us, yeah, so,
Thank you.
yeah.
One more thing, Doug, great presentation. I had a draft number 310 in 1970, so I didn't have to go. I don't think I've ever experienced a moment where I've been so grateful that I didn't have to go as to watching this presentation.
Well,
So thank you again for this. By the way, Doug and Chuck Searcy are gonna be on Friendly Fire here
Yes.
in a few weeks on WMPG FM. And it was a great interview, and, you know, Chuck, well, like you said, what a guy. He's been
Oh.
devoted his life since, what, 1994?
Yeah,
He's been over there
He's
working with
amazing,
me and
yeah.
these people, yeah. And you also have an interview coming up with,
Chris Hedges tomorrow.
oh,
I'm gonna be on the Chris Hedges show. Anybody know who Chris Hedges is?
yeah.
Yeah.
He had a PE conference a few years ago, quite notoriously.
Oh, yeah, Judy could, he was at our 2010 conference, Veterans for Peace, our 25th anniversary, right? Yeah, he was our keynote speaker for the banquet, right? And I don't know Chris Hedges. He's obsessed, let's say that. And he stayed at Dud's house, right? My friend Dud Henry, he stayed there, you know, and he suffered from PTSD. He's a war journalist. He's seen a lot, gone through a lot. And so he did this presentation at this, you know, banquet, everybody's sitting around eating, and it was really hardcore, you know. Basically, this was 2010, basically looking at us and saying, we're screwed. We better get formed little communities and get together and get ready, because the shit's coming down the road, right? And then, so he did that kind of stuff, but we're not stupid, okay? The next person to stand up to the microphone is Paul Stuckey. Peter Paul and Mary. Peter Paul. And he gets up with his guitar and he looks around and he says, okay, I'm gonna take this a different direction. And I know what song he played, but it was like, oh, yeah, you're all right. But then I was talking to Hedges afterwards, and I said, you know, you did something that most people don't do, which is, after that thing was over with, we met in the bars and all kinds of stuff. The conversation continued for hours at end, arguing about what Hedges said. He's an asshole. No, he's not. He's a good guy. Blah, 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 blah. And he said, because most keynote speakers, they walk away going, oh, he's nice. Not Hedges. So I don't know what's going to happen. And I talked to him on the phone yesterday. I said, so what's going on? What do you want? And he said, well, just tell me about your trip and read some poems and stuff. But Chuck Searcy knew Chris Hedges, and Chris Hedges was objected to some of the stuff that Chuck was doing back and forth. So I don't know where it's going to go.
What time?
12:30. Yes.
As an immigrant from the country Denmark, and having spoken to many of my relatives about the Nazis during World War II, and it was something that many of them tried not to talk too much about. But I hope we can all realize that there are some situations where one has to realize that there are some groups of people that are just not good people. And I'm sorry, but the Nazis and what they did during World War II is something that is very difficult to think about when, you know.
Do you know the movie Force More Powerful? In the book, Force More Powerful? It's 6 25-minute documentary films about nonviolent resistance. They ended with the Danish resistance to the Germans. And basically, the Germans took over Denmark in, 2 days, But the whole point was they did not cooperate. Their resistance was non-cooperation. And so they would start sabotaging. They were supposed to be making ships there for the Nazis. They would sabotage the ships. They would do this, this, and this. So they were not picking up weapons, because as they say in the movies, that we would have picked up weapons out of the net. They would just blown us away, right? So we let them come into our country and stuff like that, and then we just slowly but surely sabotaged what they were doing, which is another form of resistance. So Danish people, it's like, man.
Well, also, my father never talked about those things, And I did not know till after my father died and my cousin was in the military, he got access to material that was not available to the public. He said, my God, you wouldn't have known what your father did in the resistance, because people didn't talk about it.
That's right.
Because my father used to say, you want to protect people, you don't want to talk about stuff that might, so.
There's a guy in Ukraine. We have a special guest, and here's this guy, Zoom, guy from the basement of his house from Ukraine, saying, okay, I'm the leader of the nonviolent resistance in Ukraine. Just like, well, he's now under arrest, you can call him a Russian sympathizer. And his heart, if you listen to him, and you can go to our website and